we're welcoming you to another event in the TREATS series. TREATS, as you know, stands for Translational Research Ethics and Applied Topics. And today we have the great pleasure and privilege of hearing from Dr. Lauren Nephew. Dr. Nephew is an assistant professor of medicine in the Division of Gastroenterology and Hepatology at IU. She is particularly interested in understanding the barriers to liver transplantation that exist for vulnerable populations, and looking at the impact of social and structural determinants of health on the outcome of patients with liver disease, and especially disparities of care in the care of patients with hepatocellular carcinoma. She trained in her residency at Mass General Hospital and did fellowships at the University of Pennsylvania. She also went to Case Western Reserve for medical school and completed a master's program in bioethics. And while at the University of Pennsylvania, she completed a Master's of Science in Clinical Epidemiology. She is a health equity champion, and we are so honored that you're here today, Dr. Nephew. I think you're going to be talking about diversity in clinical trials, but take it away.
Right. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I am going to share my screen. And hopefully then share my slide deck. Is everyone seeing my title slide in slide mode, hopefully?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, okay. All right, well, I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all about this topic of clinical trial diversity and who is accountable. As someone who does clinical research, this is a topic that's just really important to me. And I'm also excited to put on my bioethics hat a little bit today. So we'll cover 3 questions in this talk, and hopefully have some conversation around these 3 questions at the end. So why is clinical trial diversity important? So why should we care? Why is it something that we should all be striving for? And that's important because you want to know the why. Why should you be putting your efforts towards this? And so we'll talk about that first. And then we can talk about how pervasive the problem is. So what is the problem? How pervasive is it? And why do I think it's an issue? Where does the issue stem from? And what are the issues that are kind of driving this problem? And then, of course, we want to talk about solutions. And so are there solutions to this problem of disparities in clinical trial enrollment? If there are solutions, who's accountable for those solutions? Who's responsible for making sure they are seen through? And so those are where we will go today. Those are questions that I hope we can answer today. So why is clinical trial diversity important? Well, there are therapeutic goals of research. Certainly, we do research because we want to advance and undergo promotion, but mostly our goals are to improve the outcomes of the patients that we serve. And we want to come up with effective therapies. And if we don't have diversity in our clinical trials, then we are really unable to generalize the therapies that we have to a diverse population. And specifically, we think about some of the challenges we face with difficult to treat populations with high blood pressure or autoimmune hepatitis, or some of the more challenging conditions that often plague vulnerable populations. And if they are not enrolled in the clinical trials, then it's really tough to know how they respond to therapy. So we really want to know if we can come up with effective therapies for these groups. We need to have the most challenging groups with the most challenging conditions in these studies. Similarly, we want to minimize side effects. So when we're coming up with medications, we want them to be effective, and we want them to have a few side effects. And we want to make sure we're minimizing side effects in all groups. And so without having diverse clinical trials, we don't have safety data in a diverse population. And again, if we have certain populations where we're maxing out therapies, then we have a real potential to also be maximizing poor effects and having maximum side effects. And so that is certainly not a goal that we want to be striving for. So we want to minimize side effects, and we need to have diverse clinical trials to be able to do that. And then finally, one of our goals of research, of course, is to be seeking good outcomes for our patients. And many of the best and kind of newest drugs are really accessed through clinical trials. And so we want to be able to reduce health disparities. And we can't do that if vulnerable populations can't access clinical trials or don't access clinical trials. And so a therapeutic goal certainly is to have our vulnerable populations be able to access those investigational, new, exciting drugs. And if we don't have diverse clinical trial enrollment, then certainly we aren't able to do that. And so why is clinical trial diversity important? It's important because we need to reach these therapeutic research goals. It's also notable that there's differences in exposure and response for diverse groups. We know that there can be underlying differences in genetics. These may be minimal between racial and ethnic groups, but there's certainly differences in comorbidity burden, renal disease, hepatic dysfunction, diabetes, differences in socioeconomic situations, geography, people's lived environment, differences in drug metabolism, and these things affect drug response and how effective these medicines are going to be in different groups and what their side effect profile is going to be. And so if we don't have diverse populations in these studies, again, we don't have a real good understanding of how effective the medicine is going to be. And again, we aren't able to minimize those side effects. In addition to our therapeutic goals of clinical research, we have an ethical imperative, right? And so that's an additional reason why diversity in clinical trials is so important. And so we have an ethical imperative to kind of uphold these principles. And so the Belmont Report in 1974 was written and summarized for us what our ethical imperatives were. And certainly we know that there's respect for person, which says that we should have autonomy for patients in our clinical trials, and that we need to protect those who have diminished autonomy. And certainly we always think about do no harm. That's a maxim in medicine as well as in clinical research, and we want to minimize harm to patients in clinical trials. But justice, I think, sometimes gets a little bit of a kind of swept under. We don't think about this principle as much, but it is also important and something that we need to be thinking about. Certainly in 1974, they were thinking about justice a little bit differently. They were thinking about how to protect the vulnerable from being involved in kind of just being easily accessed, from making sure that we weren't exploiting prisoners, we weren't just exploiting the poor, we weren't just researching on people who were easily accessible. But certainly we also need to be thinking about the benefits and the burdens on the other side, right? So if research is supported by public funds, and we want to develop therapeutic devices and procedures using those public funds, then everyone should be able to benefit who has supported those public funds. And so everyone should be able to access that clinical research or be a part of that clinical research, and should be able to also benefit. And so not only do we need to think about the burden of burdening vulnerable populations, but also some of the benefits that come along with being a part part of clinical research that people may not be able to access when we leave them out of clinical trials. So how pervasive is the problem of racial disparities in clinical trial enrollment? And why do I think it's an issue? Well, racial disparities in clinical trial enrollment, it's pretty pervasive, unfortunately. So this is a snapshot of the US population. And you can see here in the turquoise that African Americans or Black persons make up about 12% of the US population, and Hispanic Americans make up about 16% of the population. This is a little bit dated, it's probably about 18 to 20% now. And if you look at clinical trial enrollment, just kind of taking overall clinical trials for kind of all types of medicine, drugs, interventions, you can see the representation in clinical trials is much lower than that. And this has gone up slightly since this figure, but not much, still less than what would be expected based on the numbers of persons in the US population. And so why is this an issue? And certainly mistrust is something that comes to people's mind immediately. The reason why racial and ethnic minorities are not involved in clinical trials is mistrust. And certainly that is a big reason. And so I say we tackle that one first. And one of the first things that I think is important to think about when you think about mistrust is that it's an earned mistrust. Okay, this is not something that's just made up in people's minds. This is something that happened and it's real and it is not remote. This is an illustration of Dr. Marion Sims. He is often coined as the founding father of gynecology, and he performed experiments on enslaved Black women without anesthetics, 20 to 30 procedures at a time on them to perfect his surgical procedures. And this is something that is widely kind of talked about in communities of color. Many will say, well, that was a long time ago. The people who that happened to are no longer alive. Well, this is a picture of a person who was alive from the Tuskegee or the U.S. Public Health Service experiment at Tuskegee. And this is President Clinton, who is apologizing to one of the survivors of that experiment. And I like this picture because it's very modern. We all know President Clinton, we all know President Gore, and it just centers for you that these are not things that happened 100 years ago. These are things that happened recently. And this is someone who this happened to. And so people sit around the table in the South and they have lived this and talk about this. And so this is something that is a lived experience for people's relatives. And so it is certainly earned mistrust. However, it is not the only barrier to people participating in research. And there are a lot of other barriers that I think are much likely driving people's participation or lack of participation in research. And so there are patient-centered barriers like access-related barriers, just access to providers with knowledge about trials, where people get care in the community at health centers that may not be academic health centers, and they may just not have access to providers who really know about these clinical trials. They don't have transportation to and fro to be able to go to and enroll in a clinical trial that requires 5 study visits. They don't have opportunity and awareness about trials. They don't have providers who are willing to refer them to clinical trials. Again, there's mistrust and there's fear about side effects. There's research literacy issues. There's some misunderstanding about randomization and placebo and what that means. And there's a belief that clinical trials really may not have any benefit to them at all and are just for the benefit of the system and the PIs. And then there are cultural issues around excluding family members and a lack of patient-provider relationship, which becomes really big when you are sending someone to be enrolled in a trial at a center where they don't know really anybody and they don't really have a relationship with that provider. There are provider barriers where providers in the community really don't have information about trial sites, about the PIs who are enrolling. They have lack of familiarity with the inclusion criteria. They don't believe that patients will adhere to protocols. They believe that patients aren't interested. They're concerned that they're going to lose their patients. Which is a really big and probably valid concern, quite honestly, to the clinical practice if they refer patients to clinical trials at academic centers. There are logistical issues about lack of time to discuss clinical trials when there's so many other competing interests that are real that need to be discussed. And then just the distance of getting to clinical trial sites. So there are many other real patient and provider barriers in addition to just earned mistrust that prevent racial and ethnic minorities from really being able to participate in clinical trials. Despite the mistrust issue, there is a willingness among racial and ethnic minorities to participate in trials. So this is an older study, but I like it because it begins to describe this kind of willingness of racial and ethnic minorities to participate in trials. And it was called the Tuskegee Legacy Project. And it was administered to a little over 1,100 persons around the United States. And it measured fear really around research studies. And yes, indeed, Black participants had almost twice a likelihood of being afraid to be in research studies. But there was no difference in self-reported willingness to participate. And many of us can think about situations where we're afraid to do stuff, but you still do it. Okay, so people have fear, people have mistrust, but they were still willing to participate, particularly if their physician was doing the research, which really speaks to that patient-provider relationship. And there's plenty of data to support that this is true. This is some phase 1 study data, just looking at participants in the Northeast and the South, just looking at the diversity of participation in phase 1 trials. You can see here that 42% of participants in phase 1 trials in the Northeast were Black, 54% in the Southwest were Hispanic. How are they able to do this in these phase 1 trials? Well, most phase 1 trials occur in the private sector. There's limited physician investigator involvement. They use trained recruiters. Many are bilingual. They're trained in how to recruit. They're located in urban areas, right? So they're located where people are, facilitating access to diverse populations, and they provide financial incentives for participation. So if you can overcome some of these social determinants of health, language, money, location, you really can see that some of this mistrust is there, but people are willing. May say, well, everybody will participate in a phase 1 trial, right? That's not that big a deal. There are not that many risks, but this is some data looking at surgical intervention studies, and you can see there are a number of studies here. This is 7,000 patients who are offered enrollment. The consent rate for non-Hispanic white patients versus all minority groups was similar. Oh, excuse me. But the offer rate, only 5.1% in minority groups. So they're not getting asked. If you don't ask people, how do you expect them to enroll? So this just looks at some of the provider bias and barriers to providers even asking minorities about enrolling in clinical trials. Even more recent data looking at phase 3 study enrollment for participation in the COVID vaccine trials. This data is looking at Pfizer's and Moderna's phase 3 studies. And you can see that the Black and Latinx and Hispanic participation was fairly high. Black participation approaching nearly what it is in the US population, and Hispanic and Latinx participation at or nearly over what it is in the US population. And they were able to do that by leveraging many of the um, 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 mechanisms that they did in the phase 1 studies that we talked about earlier, placing trial sites in urban areas, having weekend enrollment, leveraging community partnerships, really investing in some of the strategies, translators to overcome some of those social determinant and logistical barriers that prevent people from participating. So again, people want to participate if we can make it happen. So are there solutions to the problems of racial disparities in clinical trial enrollment? And if so, who is accountable? So there is a problem recognition by the ecosystem. The ecosystem, I say, is kind of the stakeholders, the milieu of people who are involved in this recognize that there's a problem, and they have began to come out with guidance and statements around this, which I think is a great first step. So the FDA issued guidance on enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations in November of 2020. It's a really well-written document, and I have it kind of boxed as one of the places to go if you are enrolling patients and you're having difficulty and you're trying to figure out kind of what are some of the things that I can do to help in this area. And I think that their document is well written. Even more detailed and a really amazing document is the Brigham and Williams Hospital and multi-regional clinical trial working group document that was published in 2020 in their toolkit. This document is not for the faint of heart, over 200 pages. It is more of an encyclopedia, but it is fabulous, and also gets at strategies for clinical trial enrollment, and the toolkit is also very nice. Pharma has also come out with their first ever kind of problem recognition strategy document in 2020. They came up together with kind of a strategy document, and as well as the National Academy of Science. And so I think my point here is to say that people, stakeholders, the ecosystem, they recognize that there is an issue. They've put together working groups. They're investing time, which is kind of the first investment, I think, in this problem, and coming up with some solutions on paper to how we can move forward. But I think the next step probably is needed. This started happening around 2020, 2021. And I would say that the next step probably to me is a little bit more accountability as a solution. So accountability is the obligation to explain, justify, and take responsibility for one's actions, right? So there we're explaining, we're kind of justifying, we're coming up with some explanations, but at some point, somebody's got to take responsibility for these things happening. There are lots of explanatory documents out here now, but who's going to own up and take responsibility for these things actually being accomplished? And I think that I'm interested to see if that happens. And who is accountable? I think that there are a few groups who could take responsibility and be accountable. The Food and Drug Administration, pharmaceutical companies and funding agencies, and then us in the scientific community. I think the onus is on us as well. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about our accountability in this as well. And so our current challenges, I think lack of accountability is where we are now. I think that's a good place to be. In 2017, we were farther back than that, right? We didn't even have any solutions kind of written down. Now we've got some solutions, we've got some guidebooks. Now we've got to have somebody say, okay, how can we be accountable now that we've got some guidance about how to do these things? So I think in terms of accountability, I think the FDA could step up. They've written this really nice statement, it's strong, but I think they could put some mandates into place about diverse enrollment, that this is what we expect to see. This is what we expect, given the population here in the United States for enrollment. If they put that in paper, people would follow suit. Pharma and funders would allocate money specifically for the goal to make this happen. Because if drugs were not going to be approved, if they did not have diverse enrollment, then people would have to fund strategies for enrollment, right? Because they knew their drugs would not get through the pipeline. And then they would also require PIs to kind of write strategic plans and deliverables based on the money that they allocate us, because they would expect that they wouldn't just give us money, right? We would have to write a plan for what we do with that money to make these things happen. And then I think scientific journals should require race and ethnicity data be reported and explain if we don't report it, why? And if we have low enrollment in our clinical trials, what happened? You may do everything in the world and it sometimes just doesn't work out. That's fine. What happened and what's the implication for your study? I think that if this kind of accountability happened, everything downstream could fall into place. Infrastructure could be built for clinical trials in underserved communities. We can invest in that infrastructure so that there could be clinical trial sites in non-traditional locations, not just in academia, at federally funded healthcare locations, so that we weren't just dependent on enrolling at IU, so that patients could be enrolled where they are. We can engage in community partnerships then. We can educate where people are, share research findings, and trust build. I think that providers need to work on exclusionary clinical trial design. Many times we just very quickly write clinical trial designs that exclude people with chronic kidney disease, exclude people with diabetes, exclude people with this. It makes our analysis a lot easier, but we often end up then excluding a lot of vulnerable populations. And so I think we need to consider that and who we're excluding with our exclusion criteria. And then I think we all need implicit bias training for our full research staff. And then finally, I think at the patient level, there are lots of logistic issues that keep people from being able to participate. And I think that if we have funding from the top that came down, these things could be budgeted in, and these things could be dealt with. And so we could do shared rides and lifts and weekend hours and translators and all the things that I wish that I could pay for in my studies, but don't quite have the budget for. So in conclusion, why is clinical trial diversity important? We need to achieve all those therapeutic goals, and it's our ethical imperative to do so. It is the just thing to do. How pervasive is the problem of racial disparities in clinical trial enrollment? Why is it an issue? It's pretty pervasive, and there's an earned distrust, but there's willingness and an interest in participating. If we can overcome the social and structural barriers to participation. And are there solutions to the problem of racial disparities in clinical trial enrollment and who is accountable? Yes, I think there are solutions, but they require recognition that there's a problem worth fixing, a willing ecosystem, which I think we have, financial time and investment and accountability, which we don't quite have, at multiple levels to ensure this happens. I'd like to thank everybody for their time. These are the two references that were boxed that I think are quite nice guidance documents about how to increase clinical trial enrollment. And I will pause here.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was just terrific. Would you be willing to take some questions if people?
Of course. Give me 1 second to get
Alrighty.
off of to fix my technology. Hold on. Because I'm trying to figure out how to make the screen bigger and stop share, but let's see. Oh, here we go. Stop share. Okay.
There you are.
Here I am. Okay.
Great. Great.
Happy
And
to
I
take
don't,
any questions if people have any.
question? Excuse me, I have to step away just for a minute. Keep going.
Excuse me.
I have a question. I am wondering, Dr. Nephew, about when I approach people about research, and I can tell that there is lack of trust, maybe people of color, and they heard the word research, and I can just tell they shut down. Do you have any recommendations on how to approach people in a way that makes them feel safer?
Yeah, I find that if people they know can approach them first is helpful.
Okay.
So if if we're going to enroll patients who we don't know, and I can get their provider to even mention that we're going to enroll, I can even say, hey, I really want to enroll your patient in our research study. Is there any way you can let them know my coordinator is outside the room? Even if that can get them to make the introduction. Because I think when people of color have no connection of who you are, you just kind of catch them in a waiting room and you're just like, hey, will you be in my research study? They're very leery of new people and no relationship. So I think if you can get someone they know to make even the briefest introduction, someone they do trust, not to go over the whole research study because they don't have time for that, but just to say, hey, one of my colleagues is going to talk to you about their research study, that those 10 words go a long way.
Okay.
Um,
Thank you. Thank you.
Right.
Lauren, Mary Ott, I'm in adolescent medicine in the Center for Bioethics. So first, thank you for a phenomenal talk. I learned a ton and super excited about it. One of the things I struggle with in epidemiologic research is how to handle reporting of race and ethnicity. Like as a social construct, I want to see is there a hypothesis because this isn't a biological factor? Like, how do I handle it? Do I include it in the analysis, not include it in the analysis? I think because including it in the analysis sort of perpetuates a lot of these false stereotypes. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about you were talking, this is a lot on the front end of inclusion, but on the back end, in terms of analysis and reporting results.
Ooh, the struggle. It's such a struggle on the data analysis side. I am always struggling with that, right? I'm a firm believer as race is a social construct, but as a social construct, it has had biologic consequences often that that are deeply embedded. I am very careful about putting race into models now, much more careful than I was 2 years ago, even. And so I will often, I'm so careful about it. I mean, it's a very thoughtful question. I will stratify sometimes instead of putting it in as a multivariable to kind of just see, what the odds ratio would be for each race, just to kind of it depends on kind of what the question is, but I'm very careful about just throwing it in a model now. So I think in a table one, fine. I mean, you just want to know what your population is. But in terms of multivariable model building, I think, it's probably, often best as like an effect modifier or kind of stratifying by race. I'm careful about just throwing it in the model. But again, it depends. Sometimes it may be okay. It may be appropriate. It kind of depends on what the hypothesis is. But I think you have to be really thoughtful and then really thoughtful about it in your discussion about what it means, if you did put in the model. What it look like without it, what it meant with it. And I think if you can tell people if you can tell people that, it can be helpful. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think, thinking about it, looking at it as both ways, with and without it, and stratifying by it can sometimes really tell a story. You're muted though.
No, sorry, I'm on an editorial board for the Journal of Pediatrics, and we've been talking about like how to handle reviews of papers and thinking about like, is there a hypothesis around race? Do they do any exploration of mediating factors for this social construct?
Yeah.
Instead of like making white the reference race, do they have like a population mean that they may use as a referent, because we now have like better statistical techniques than we had 30 years ago? And so your sort of off the cuff answer is very similar to some of the things that I've been looking at and thinking about in my role on an editorial board. So thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Lauren, I just have a sort of a more personal question about, so how are things at Indiana? How is the diversification within our clinical trial? I mean, how receptive are people to what you're doing? And anyway.
Depends on the trial.
Okay.
I am currently enrolling for a pretty easy study about, social determinants in liver cancer, and our enrollment rate for Black and Hispanic patients is like 80%, but they don't have to come back. You know what I mean? They do everything on that first study visit. It's a lot of paperwork, but we pay them and they don't have to come back. We've got another study we're enrolling for alcohol-associated hepatitis. That's got a lot of study visits. And we can't enroll anybody regardless of race. So I would say, and then I hear other investigators, it's mixed. So it depends on the study. I think it really, if there are a lot of study visits, it can be challenging for anybody, but I think we see barriers, more logistical barriers than overall research, like distrust altogether. I see people really kind of interested in being involved in research. I don't find a lot of people who are just kind of shut me down altogether. Because again, we have 80% approach, 80% enrollment of the people that we approach.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
And I see that Dr. Schwartz has arrived.
Well, I'm a shameless person at, asking questions, even though I didn't hear the talk, but I'm not that shameless. I'm sorry, Lauren, I had another obligation for 1:30. Yeah. So I'll defer to others.
Lauren, I'm struck by the finding that investigators are not offering clinical trial participation to, for me, it would be like adolescents and families from minoritized groups. And I'm wondering if you have like really specific recommendations that you can give investigators around this.
I think people have a false idea that people of color are gonna say no. I think they just, I even think that sometimes, you sometimes just have this thought, that, they've just got too much going on. They've got, kids, just too many barriers. Like, they're gonna say no, but they don't. So I think there's just a misconception that that there's this, and there is mistrust though, right? I mean, it's not like that's not true. That is there. But I think depending on who's asking, people will say yes. especially if they know you. So when I ask patients, they often say yes. But if I'm asking people I know, but I think providers don't really know that, and they get nervous that nobody likes rejection, right? And so, I mean, bias is bias, but in terms of what's driving that, nobody wants to hear no. When we hire research coordinators, we're always looking for those people who are okay with that no, right? Because if you're not willing to get in there, if you're scared of rejection, then you're not going to be a good research coordinator. And so if you're scared that a Black patient or Hispanic patient is going to say no, then you may just not ask. And if somehow you've been tuned to think that they're going to say no, you may just not ask. So I think just some kind of re-education around that belief. And then, and helping patients to understand what the benefits are. I think patients of color don't often, if they know what the benefits are, if a provider they know is asking them, I think those two things together help them to say yes. And so, I mean, that may be true of any patient, but I think that patients of color, as long as they need to feel like it's not just something the system is doing to advance it itself, but that it's something that could be a benefit, not just to them, but to other people who look like them, who have the disease that they have. And if they can understand those things, and it's somebody they know and trust, that those things together will help them to say yes. And if providers can understand that they're willing to say yes, and that they aren't going to be rejected any more than anybody else. I think that we may get somewhere.
Well, in the absence of any more questions, I've just Meg is letting it go. She's talk about discomfort, right? There's silence on the line. Peter Schwartz gets nervous and starts to think, well, maybe it's time to end. And again, I didn't have the benefit of listening. I'll see it on recording. Meg is waving her hand though.
Well, this is, I'm not a researcher, Lauren. I clinical research, except in the Conscience Project. But I would just echoing the sense of the mistrust. So my clinical practice was at Wishard, Eskenazi, and the health centers, and I found that, and I was there for a long time and had lots of patients with whom I became close. But sometimes, even with those patients whom I knew, I would say something like, "We have this new drug." I was dermatology, so skin stuff. So I said, "We have this new drug, and I really think it." And I could see this look on the face, and it's just like, "Experiment?" I go, "No, not an experiment." But once we, then I think most often the patient felt much better. I didn't mean it as an experimental drug. I was excited because it was something new that we could offer for eczema or psoriasis, or even a new antibiotic. But so it's just interesting to think about the words that we use, and then to stay in the conversation, as you're saying, so you don't just like, okay, never mind. Anyway.
Yeah, I think, people don't want to feel like they're perhaps that they're being experimented on for the benefit of, benefit of everyone, but not for the benefit of them, perhaps. And I think, that they're being exploited. And there's this fear I'm being used, or they're going to use me. They're using me for their benefit. And I'm not getting anything out of this really, but they're really just using me. And I can't get God, like, and I have to always be on the lookout for a situation where I may be, you know, there may be something, someone out to get me because, you know, so, which, you know,
Because someone had been out to get.
because somebody had been. So, so I've got to have this kind of extra defense up to kind of, you know, be on the lookout. So, I like, you know, and these were people you knew, and they still had their kind of ears up, like, whoa, she said new.
Right. For me, it was very important. That was a really important, and I was grateful for the conversation. It made me much more sensitive to what the patient was hearing, which was not at all what I was intending. And so I was, anyway, it's interesting. Thank you again.
See, now I've heard enough to ask another question. So I'm sorry, but I'll pick up on this discussion you're having. Please just stop me if it's something you covered earlier, Lauren. You know, I teach, actually, I taught a thing about diversity and enrollment recruitment to the KL2 scholars. You remember we were talking about doing that with Laura DeMaglio and Linda DeMaglio. And what we talked about was payment for like for phase 1 trials. You know, there's so many examples of phase 1 trials where, you know, that worry, Meg, you mentioned of being taken advantage of because risks maybe haven't been described or payment actually has been inadequate, you know, because we don't pay or whatever. And so actually I almost think like a patient who distrusts you is almost the patient who's more reasonable and the patient who does trust you. And in some ways the challenge is to live up to the skeptical patient. And to, I mean, the session I ran, we talked about paying people better for phase 1 where there's no real reasonable benefit to the individual except for the pay, as well as, you know, it's nice if they can help, but the actual benefit of the individual is really only the pay. And so we should pay better. We should pay actually a lot more than we've ever been comfortable paying. And that's a response in some ways to a skeptical patient who says, why should I do this? Whereas before we had patients that, oh yeah, maybe I should because I feel obligated or something. And in that latter case, well, it's very nice to have so much trust. And I hope we've earned it with some groups. I don't know if any groups really should trust us that much to volunteer in a phase 1 trial. You know, we're being given an untested medication and you're a healthy person who couldn't benefit from the medication. So I don't know, I think that's almost a healthy skepticism. Now, of course, having sat in clinic and tried to convince patients to get the vaccine, I know the line that gets crossed from healthy skepticism to very, very hurtful skepticism for their own health. Do you think about that, Lauren? Did you speak about this in the talk? I'm sorry that I'm gathering late, and just tell me that.
We talked a little bit about phase 1 trial enrollment and some of the reasons that minority enrollment is actually really good in phase 1 trial enrollment. And some of the reasons for that is the fact that they're often located in the urban areas. They're often not run by academic centers. They often use recruiters. Some of the phase 1 sites do pay well. And those things can be coercive, but I think the risks tend to be fairly low for phase 1. And so people, I think in general, are willing to participate because they can the trial sites are where they live and they get paid and the risks are relatively low, as opposed to phase 3, which are often at academic centers, are run by physicians, and are kind of barriers because they aren't really in the communities where people live logistically, and don't really pay as well, quite frankly. But so we didn't talk about that here, but I talked about it a little bit in the talk, but
that's fascinating.
It is fascinating. never been a healthy subject in a phase 1, but I know people sign up for them because they feel like they're kind of low risk, high reward.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Okay, so Meg, I will defer to you in terms of whether we should go on or finish up. Well, then Meg's waving. So I'll go ahead and thank you, Laura, I guess, so much for doing this, Dr. Nephew. I appreciate it so much. I'm sorry for the scheduling thing that I couldn't be here, but I will be logging off now and watching the recording probably as soon as Emily Varank can get it to me. So thanks again so much for doing it. All these talks, as Meg probably mentioned, are available online on our treats page on the Center for Bioethics website. It's under our ethics resources section. And so this will be immortalized now. Including my asking a question after a talk I didn't see. And along with, there'll be some references too that Dr. Nephew spoke about in the talk. You can click on those there for content. So again, thanks everybody for being here, and thank you especially Dr. Nephew for speaking, and thank you Meg for saving my butt as usual and filling in.
Thank you, Lauren. It was wonderful to see you. I hope we get to teach together again sometime.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invite.
Bye.